Elijah chapter 19. That's that chapter, if you don't remember, where Elijah has just had his pinnacle moment in chapter 18. If you're familiar with his life, he has just had this confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and God does this amazing miracle, shows that he is God. The prophets of Baal are put to death, and it should be a glorious moment. And yet in the very next chapter, he's running for his life and hiding in a cave. And sometimes that happens in our lives, doesn't it? That we go through periods, and they may not always make sense, where we can feel defeated, where we can feel discouraged or overwhelmed, or saying, nothing has turned out the way that I thought that it should turn out. We don't know exactly why Elijah took this moment to have a little bit of a spiritual breakdown. It's very possible that his expectations did not match reality. And we can understand how the human heart would go. It's been really hard, it's been really hard, it's been really hard, but now there will be this confrontation between the one true God and the false prophets, and God powerfully demonstrated that he alone is God, that he is the true God. And there was probably then the underlying expectation that there would be revival, that this would bring a change. But what happened? There was a quick, temporary change, maybe a ripple, and then things went back to normal. The wicked king Ahab is still the king. Jezebel, his wife, is still breathing out murderous threats, and she's unchecked. And people are continuing as they always continued. The reality doesn't meet the expectation. There's a lot of other reasons, if we understand, human motivation and psychology, about why there could be such a letdown. Many of you have had that after a retreat or a weekend, a men's weekend, a women's weekend, some big revival that you went to, and you're on the spiritual high, and then you come back to reality, and you just feel like the bottom drops out. Because all of a sudden now you have to get back to living life. And we are in a spiritual battle. And many times you can come home from the best weekend of your life, making these promises to God, feeling so close to him, and you open the door and your spouse is looking at you with those eyes of, while you have been gone, things have not been well. And they ask you to do something with the children that is legal but severe. And you're like, and it begins, right? Because we understand that reality doesn't stop. And in this broken world, people continue to live in disobedience to their Maker. And we have the effects of this fallen, sinful world. And we can't say exactly what's plaguing Elijah. We get some hints as we go through the text. We don't know that this is a total sum of all of his disappointments and discouragements. But we read in the first 4 verses of chapter 19 here, as this great thing has just happened. The prophets of Baal have just been annihilated. The drought has ended. Rains are coming back to the land. And then, verse 1 of chapter 9, it says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had executed all the prophets," that's the false prophets, "with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, 'So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time.' And when he saw that, he arose and he ran for his life, and he went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die. And he said, 'It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" So Elijah's run away to Beersheba. That's quite a distance, especially on foot. Where he was, Mount Carmel is in the north of the land of Israel. Israel is about the size of New Jersey. Modern day of Israel. So basically consider walking 2/3 of the way across New Jersey. So it's a good journey to Beersheba. He gets down there south, and he leaves his servant. He has somebody accompanying him, and he goes further out into the wilderness, sits underneath a broom tree, and says, it'd be better if I die. Obviously, not exactly the zenith that he didn't ride this victory emotionally for a long time. Elijah is struggling. And then it says, then he lay down and he slept under the broom tree, and suddenly an angel touched him and said, arise and eat. And then he looked, and by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and he drank, and he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. So what's the first interaction that Elijah has with God? Now, he prays to God, not a very spiritually mature prayer, but yet an emotionally raw and real prayer. He says, it's enough. I just want to die. I'm done. I'm done. And he goes to sleep. And God hears him exactly where he is. There should be some consolation for you and for me. Sometimes we have very sanitized prayers. We talked about this in this study of Habakkuk. We keep our thoughts inward, and then we try to run it through, a translator as we try to send our prayers to God. God, I know that you have anything under control, and I know it's okay, but I'm really kind of struggling. When what you really want to do is like, what is going on? What is going on? I'm hurting. Are you here? At least Elijah's being honest with himself as well as with God. And we always have to balance, respect and appropriateness with the Almighty, of course, but being authentic. God already knows how we feel. We've talked about this a lot. And God doesn't come down with a heavy hand, like, how dare you? I called you to be a prophet. I've been there for you every step of the way, and now you're doubting me? Now what does he do? Bake some food. Hey, wake up. I made you some food. We don't see a thank you by Elijah here. He just goes back to sleep. Apparently he's like 14. So he goes back to sleep, and God wakes him up a second time after a rest and says, hey, there's some more. This journey is too much for you. This journey is too much. Eat some more. And then Elijah goes and he walks even further to Mount Horeb. So, by the way, where's Mount Horeb? You may look in your Bible and say, I can't see it on a map. Mount Horeb is just another name for Mount Sinai. It's in the land of Midian. That's the mountain where Moses had the encounter with the burning bush. It's a mountain where Moses later brought the people back to receive the 10 Commandments, right? They call it the mountain of God because of the history where God manifested himself powerfully to the Hebrew people and the birth of the Israelites as a nation. He goes back to that first place. Whether intentionally or not, he took 40 days from Beersheba. One man should have been able to make it longer than 40 days. So we don't know his state. We don't know how he's traveling. He may have been meandering and just ended up there. One of those fortuitous, and it just so happened. But one day, suddenly he's at a cave at Mount Horeb, and he has an opportunity to talk to God. It says, so there he went into a cave and spent the night in the place, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? So he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, tore down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. It sounds like he's feeling a little unappreciated, feeling completely unproductive, and feeling, what's the point? Well then, God says, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. So God gives these manifestations of just natural disaster, and you can imagine it. You have the wind, but he doesn't sense God in this wind. And then there's an earthquake, and for those of us who have lived through some pretty serious shakes, that can be pretty unsettling, but I don't sense God in this either. And then the fire. And then at the end of this, there is a still small voice. And in verse 13, we see it, and so it was when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came down to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's kind of funny. It's the same question he asked initially. The first time, Elijah's not ready to hear this. Sometimes that's where we are spiritually. We'll shout at God, we'll yell at God, we'll say, "God, why aren't you giving me any answers?" And as I've grown in maturity, I think it's oftentimes that I'm in this place because I'm not ready to listen. I'm hurting. I'm tired. I'm upset. I need to be comforted. I need to be aware of God's presence, but I'm not ready for an answer. If I was given the answer before the comfort, before God's presence, it wouldn't make any difference to me. If I was given the answer when I'm not really listening, for those of you who have children, you know how this works, right? "Dad, why can't we do this?" You're halfway through a sentence, and they're already asking another question. You're like, do you just ask questions? Maybe it's just my children. Maybe my children are just defective. I don't know. On a road trip, I mean, it's 16-hour. Oh, no. Is it 16 hours? I'm looking at the balcony. 18-hour drive from San Diego to here. They blur. Once you get past 10, everything blurs together with all the inane rambling and screaming. And he's touching me to make him stop looking at me. Whatever. You know what I'm talking about. I did that when I was a kid. My sister and I couldn't even get through breakfast without making a wall of cereal boxes. Like, it's a great wall of breakfast. It was. How do any of us live to adulthood? Honestly, this is why animals eat their young, right? Actually, my kids were great, but they did this thing many times. "Hey, Dad, how far until we get to the next town?" "Well, we're 40. "Hey, Dad, I'm like, why ask a question you don't want to hear the answer?" But do we do that with God? Of course we do. We say, "God, why does it hurt so much?" And if we're not ready to listen, he says, "Well, if you look, God, why?" No. Now Elijah's ready to listen. And we see here, he says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah says again, "I've been very zealous for the Lord of hosts because of the children of Israel. They have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Same answer. But he seems to be in a very different place. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael king over Syria. Also you shall anoint Jehu the son of Nimshi as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, and you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." God begins to speak, and he begins to tell him, "I have a job for you. Here are 3 things that you're supposed to do. Anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Anoint Jehu as the future king of Israel, the northern kingdom. And go find Elisha to be your successor. He gives him a job. He also gives him a glimpse into the future and say, what you see now is not the end. This is why some of you, when you read books, skip to the end. Because sometimes the stress and the tension, and you're like, is it going to turn out all right? And some of you, or very bad book readers, I might say, skip to the end and read it. But here's what's really great. In the Bible, we get to skip to the end. That book of Revelation was put in there for our encouragement. God speaks things in prophetic words of encouragement, which he says he does on purpose, so that we will know that where we are now is not the end of the story, but it's one of the chapters in between that are bringing it toward the resolution that has been planned. And he gives Elijah a glimpse saying, where you are now is not the end. And I have a job for you to do. Well, as I was considering these things and thinking of this passage, and I understand that the commands of this passage are not directly given to us. We have to be very careful about saying, well, God spoke this way to Elijah, so it's directly applicable to me. No, the promises and the commands to Elijah were specific to a time and place. But the character of God has not changed. And he gives us the examples of how he's worked with people in the past, so we will have a better understanding of who he is in the present. Because God's character, his person, has not changed. And people have not changed. Right? We still have the same discouragements and frustrations as Elijah has in this passage, and we can relate to them very clearly. Maybe not because of the pandemic. Maybe not because of the political unrest or the social unrest. Maybe it's something personal, or maybe it'll be something in your future, or it was something in your past. But we all can relate to this feeling of like, I'm done. What's the point? And we see how God interacts with Elijah so patiently and really so tenderly. And yet he doesn't let him wallow there, but he grabs him up, dusts him off, and puts him back to a new purpose. And he will do the same for us if we're willing to listen and we're willing to follow. One of the things we have to stop and we have to think is, what has God asked us to do? You may say, well, I've never sat in a cave and had God speak so clearly to me, and neither have I. But there are some things that God has asked us to do that we know he has asked us to do. Sometimes we want something big and dramatic. We want the earthquake or the fire or the wind. And we're like, all I've got is that still small voice. It's the same thing he gave Elijah. And God leads us and he shows us, and we need to go about doing what he calls us to do. Blackaby wrote a series a long time ago. It was called Experiencing God, and it was a study, and some of you may have gone through that. And says, and when you don't know how to get involved with God, see what he's already doing and get involved. It's really easy. If you don't know what God is asking you to do, read what he's already written to you and start making the adjustments. I guarantee not any of us have the 10 Commandments down perfectly. Right? Maybe in its legalistic, rigid, standards, but not when you start talking about the attitudes of the heart. I guarantee not any of us here are perfectly carrying out the Great Commission. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible we're just not doing. And what God is sending Elijah to do again here is really the same stuff he has been doing. But he's given him a new hope, and what he's done is he's refreshed his vision. In the Bible, in the book of Daniel, it says where there's no vision, the people will perish. A lot of times when you're feeling really, really down, you need to stop and ask this question of yourself. What are you doing here? But also, what are we supposed to be doing here? Because there are things we should be doing about living to honor God with our hearts, our minds, our strength, and to realize we're not alone. One of the great blessings that God gives us is each other. But he also is here with himself. God was with Elijah every step of the day. Even that first time where it says an angel made him like a breakfast, or I don't know, breakfast, brunch, lunch, dinner, whatever it was. He makes him a meal over the hot coals and says, wake up. Got some food for you. If you read the second time, it says the angel of the Lord. It's really possible when you look at Old Testament manifestations of Jesus Christ that it was Jesus who's cooking him a meal. Himself, the second person of the Trinity. God was with him every step of the way. See, Elijah was upset, rightfully so. But you know what he needed? He needed a break. He needed a break. And he needed some sleep. And he needed a meal. There's those commercials, right? Those Snickers commercials. You know the ones I'm talking about? I'm going to get the tagline slightly wrong. That you're not you when you're hungry. Have a Snickers. The little celebrity comes in. And some of you, we have that word hangry. I don't know if it's in the dictionary. That's hungry and angry. They had a baby, hangry. But some of us get that way. If you haven't eaten, you're just not pleasant. For me, if I haven't slept, I'm not my best. If you haven't slept and ate and taken a break to clear your mind, which is a whole sermon for another day, there's a reason in the 10 Commandments God puts in a Sabbath. And let me tell you something. We may not be bound by the Old Testament sabbatical laws, but we as 21st century Christians are really bad about taking this principle about rest and coming before God in quiet, making sure you have enough sleep, making sure you've eaten well, making sure you're taking care of your body. Because when we are run down, we make bad decisions. There is a reason that my dad told me as a child, nothing good happens after midnight, right? Because when you are tired, you make worse decisions. And that's true spiritually too. When you're tired, things get so out of focus. When you're hungry, things get out of focus for some of us. And it's not that the situations aren't real. It's just sometimes we need to take care of ourselves. So he needed a break. He needed some sleep, and he needed a good meal. He also needed a friend. I mean, he had a servant, but he seemed like he kept saying, how many times did he say, I'm alone? I'm alone. And so what does he say? Hey, step number 3 of the 3 jobs I gave you is go find Elisha. He's going to be your assistant, your protege, the guy you're going to train to take your place. And yes, that's continuing the mission of God, but it's also giving him a companion who is just as vested in the things of the Lord as he is. And if we finished this and took the time to see about Elisha coming to the Lord, his call, he's all in. He kills his oxen and has a feast and follows Elijah without reservation. He has somebody with a like mind. And he needed, as we've already said, renewed vision. If you're like, why are we here? And sometimes, let's face it, we as churches are just really good at times, like every other institution, just existing for our own self-preservation. It says every institution after 6 months, its unstated but actual goal is existing to maintain its own existence. That's the natural tendency that we pull to. Why are we doing this? So we can keep doing this. But in the church, we should take that break and stop and say, why are we here? And if we can't answer that question, we're going to end up, or have a tendency to end up, exactly where Elijah was. Not only will we not be as effective as we should be at carrying out the things God has called us to do, but we will also be discouraged, petty, tired, downcast. God gives him things to do, not because he needed Elijah to do those things, but because Elijah needed to do those things. He needed to be back on point. And of course, he needed some encouragement. I hope as believers we learn to be encouraging. There are times we need to be rebuked. There are times we need to be challenged. There are definitely all those times. But as I continue to get older, and as many of you have known for a long time, life is hard. Every single one of us at some point are going to feel like we've been pushed past the point where we cannot possibly take anything else. And we may know that God is with us. But one of the best ways to experience that is when someone else comes and says, I'm praying for you. I love you. How can I be here for you? He gives us people too. That's one of the great things about the church. To know we're not alone. I remember that in high school. Some of you remember that. It can be really lonely to be a Christian when you're the only one in a certain group. And just how much I would love at certain times in my life, I get to be around believers today. People who believe what I am and can say, it's really hard. And they can say, you're not alone. There's a lot of practical things here. And sometimes we can get so caught up in the spiritual things that we forget that God gives us some very practical steps. So if you're feeling down today, this is your pastoral edict. Wives, I know some of your husbands will pull this out if they were supposed to mow the lawn today. But if you're feeling really down, take a nap, if that's what you do. Take a nap. Yeah, yep. Have a good meal. Take a break mentally and just stop. And make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. And then don't get stuck there. After that, stop and consider, who has God called me to be and what is he asking me to do? And make sure we're connected with one another for the encouraging, for the spurring on, to be the family of God together. It's great. Elijah in the Old Testament does a few more really interesting things. He carries out these last jobs that God has given him. But his story doesn't end there. See, Elijah's not a man of weak faith. He's not a minor character in the Bible. But do you remember in the New Testament when Jesus went up to the high mountain with his disciples and he went to pray? And they took Peter and James and John and he appeared in his glory. And who appeared with him? But Moses and Elijah. The Bible says that Elijah was a man just like us. And yes, in the context in the book of James, it's talking about how his prayers, even though he was a mere man, how God heard his prayers. Actually, it says, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. In context, we're talking about prayer. But as I was thinking this morning, it reminded me, and hopefully you, that he was a man with a nature like ours. This miracle didn't happen because Elijah was special. This miracle happened because of the mighty God that he served. And we see the great things that God does through ordinary people in ordinary situations every day. Look, I know we all want big things to happen. But we need to remember what God is doing in the small things, in the quiet spaces, in the everyday moments. And we need to be faithful in those daily things. We need to be reminded that we're not alone. When God told Elijah, there's 7,000 people who are with you. They maybe not be on public platforms, but they have not turned their hearts from me. You're not alone. And I'm going to give you one person in particular who will be your assistant. He calls us to be faithful regardless. But in part of that being faithful is we need to handle the obvious things. If you want your hearts to be lifted in difficult times, start with doing the things that you know you're supposed to do. It's really easy to get all upset about the things we have no control over about. But things like loving your neighbor, praying, being a good witness, showing love and kindness, those things don't change. And when we are going about doing what we can control, and it also hopefully helps us to trust God for what we can't. Because I've read the end of the book, and we talked about this a couple months ago, and I know how it ends. I don't know what chapter we're on. I would like to give you an answer on that. I don't. But I do know that I don't want it to be done today. I mean, if I was being completely honest, some days I want it to be done today. But there's still things I want to do. And I'm not talking like catch a ball game or play catch with my kids. But before this life on earth ends, there's some things that are left undone that I want to be able to do and not have regret and saying, oh God, I meant to get around to that. So do what we know we're supposed to do. Eat a meal, take a nap, and know that God is with us in our discouragement, and he lifts us up. He shows us again where we should be going. So let's be people who will listen to his voice and be about his business. Let's pray.